WFYI podcast brought to you by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering food and drink, college sports, outdoor activities, live music, cool art, and good times daily. Everyone is welcome in Bloomington. More information at visitbloomington.com.
This is WFYI News Now. It's April 11th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, a political centrist group urges Democrats to vote in the Republican primary. An attempt to legally require informed consent for exams under anesthesia. And state officials are sounding the alarm on the rising need for emergency service workers.
What it really costs is time. Instead of a 5-minute response time, you may be looking at 20, 30, or longer.
Those stories coming up. But first, a teenager will be charged as an adult after a mass shooting in downtown Indianapolis last weekend. WFYI's Jill Sheridan has more.
Charges of criminal recklessness and dangerous firearm possession have been filed against 17-year-old King Dennis. The Marion County prosecutor says Dennis will stand trial as an adult after shooting 7 young people between the ages of 12 and 16. The shooting led IMPD to impose the state's curfew law for people under the age of 18. The incident also marks the third consecutive weekend when multiple people were shot at one location. There have been 15 incidents of gun violence involving children under 18 since the beginning of the year. I'm Jill Sheridan.
Billboards from a political centrist group are urging Hoosier Democrats to vote in this year's Republican primary. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports on the message from Recenter, Indiana, going up on roadsides in northwest, central, and southeastern Indiana.
Recenter, Indiana, formed 2 years ago, is made up of moderate Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Here's board member Linda Heitzman.
Our mission is to try to realign and recenter politics in Indiana and get away from the extremes, because we really believe that most people politically are in the middle.
The billboards urging people who usually take a Democratic ballot in the primary to vote in the Republican races this spring are focused on the open governor's race. Heitzman, a Democrat herself, says the next governor will likely be decided in the primary.
So at least I know that my vote will have some impact on the election.
Recenter Indiana will also launch a social media campaign around the issue. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recently released guidance requiring informed consent for pelvic, breast, prostate, and rectal exams under anesthesia. Because Medicare funding can be tied to compliance, most hospitals are likely to follow it. However, as Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports, one lawmaker is still pushing to add the informed consent requirements to state law.
The guidance targets teaching hospitals and medical schools. HHS says the informed consent requirement means patients must be aware of any sensitive examinations done for teaching purposes and have the right to refuse those examinations. Representative Carol Jackson says even with the new guidance, legislation that outright bans the practice of non-consensual sensitive examinations under anesthesia would be in the best interest of patients.
This will help reassure them that their issues and that their problems are going to take care of and their privacy will be respected.
Jackson has proposed legislation the past 4 years that would require informed consent from patients, but the legislation has not received a committee hearing. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
And for our final story today, state officials are sounding the alarm on a rising need for emergency service workers as call volume escalated from 2019 to 2022. The issue is multifaceted, but as Binti Boutier reports, the Indiana Department of Homeland Security's EMS division hopes increased support through education will bridge workforce gaps.
Does anybody know, can anybody name one vital? Say it louder.
Blood pressure.
Blood pressure, excellent. Another one? Respiratory rate? Pulse, okay.
It's a Thursday morning at Ivy Tech Bloomington. About 10 students gather around a couple tables and review how to check someone's vitals.
I gotta write it down.
Part of an emergency medical technician course, they'll take a test with Ivy Tech. If they pass, they take a national exam for certification. If numbers track with last year, they'll be among approximately 15,000 people who received some type of EMS training and certificate in Indiana. But Keith Rademacher, Ivy Tech Bloomington's assistant chair of paramedic science, says that's not enough.
The shortages are causing ambulances to go unstaffed or understaffed every day.
Last year, there were more than 1.2 million EMS incidents in the state, and most people with an EMS certificate don't work in an ambulance. Rademacher has worked as a paramedic for decades and provides training at Ivy Tech. He says the need isn't new, but has become more apparent with rising call volumes in rural health deserts. He says if the shortage continues, people will go without service for longer, waiting for an ambulance to be available.
What it really costs is time. Instead of a 5-minute response time, you may be looking at 20, 30, or longer.
Craig Kinney is the state EMS director. He says the number of people getting certifications has remained stable over the years, but call volume increased by more than 30% between 2019 and 2022.
EMS has existed since the 1970s, and frankly, it existed and people just take it for granted. You know, I'm going to call 911, I will get an ambulance.
He says turnover is higher in the profession now. People don't renew their certification after 5 or 6 years. Wages and high stress, ambulance run reimbursement, and access to training have taken a toll. But now is an exciting time for EMS, Kinney says. It restructured at the state level last year and is now its own division in the Department of Homeland Security.
We get recognized by the legislature. We are closer with the governor's office, so we have support for that.
And the state allocated $6.4 million for 2 years as part of the governor's Public Health Commission, which is something Kinney says it's never had before. One area of focus is tracking workforce data on EMS training and EMS incidents. The other is lowering barriers to certification through workforce readiness grants, about $1.4 million allocated for 2024 to covering student EMS coursework.
There are deserts where you can have 5 or 6 counties that adjoin that may not have any training that's provided, particularly at the paramedic level. A little more common at the EMT level, but there are still many counties that don't have EMT training.
Per the 2023 EMS Workforce Assessment, 61 of Indiana's 92 counties provide training. And the state EMS office is allocating another $1.5 million for equipment grants that training programs can apply for, with a preference to programs in rural areas. In the last 3 years, Ivy Tech Bloomington graduated around 230 EMTs and 30 paramedics. It has expanded its training out to 5 surrounding counties. Ivy Tech Bloomington's Dean of Health Sciences, Carly White, says the funding for EMS education from the state is helpful for recruiting.
If students don't have to go into debt, and they can continue to get their education paid for, I think that that's a huge benefit, and it's a huge help to us in promoting our program.
When you put this thing on, nice and tight.
Between 70 to 80% of students in Ivy Tech Bloomington's EMT and paramedic programs use Next Level Jobs funding each semester.
So it's going to have to go above his elbow, so I don't, hopefully.
For WFYI News, I'm Ben Taboutier.
I'm going to slowly turn it down.
That's
what I'm doing. I'm listening. So I should have my stethoscope in, but we're just doing the numbers right now. So I'm watching.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Drew Daudelin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Abriana Herron. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.